Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Voices of Women in the Modern Middle East webinar. It's really great that you're joining us. You would have probably already seen our slide in the beginning, but we will go through the tech setup. But before that, I want to introduce to you our scholar for today. We have Barbara Petzen, who is the founder and director of the Middle East Connections. She will spend a few minutes just talking about herself when she starts talking, but she's a wonderful scholar, and we've worked with her numerous times. She has a wealth of knowledge in various regions around the world, but especially the Middle East, and we are very excited to have her today. In terms of how to participate today, please run the audio setup wizard if you haven't already. You can submit your questions in the chat box that we have provided. Please feel free to type in your questions, and I'm going to keep them till the very end when I can ask Barbara. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand, which is the button, this third button on your left. And once you raise your hand, I can know exactly when to call on you. And once I say that, yes, you may ask your question, you can press the talk button and ask your question to Barbara. We'll have about 20 minutes of questions at the end, so please try to keep them till then. But if you have something in the middle that you really want to ask, please type it in the chat box. Moving on. So just to introduce to you Primary Source for those that don't know us, we are a nonprofit organization located in Watertown, Mass., and we provide graduate courses and workshops and study tours for over 2,500 educators every year. Our mission is to provide global education to students, and we do that through the vehicle of teachers that are obviously very, very important in this mission. We really want to help teachers bring globalized curriculum into their classrooms. So we are also doing this webinar in conjunction with the IB, and global studies is very important and incorporated into the mission of the International Baccalaureate. As you can see here, part of the IB mission is to really encourage international mindedness in IB students. And to do this, they believe that students must develop an understanding of their own cultural and national identity. And all IB students do learn a second language and the skills to live and work with others internationally. Along with this, global studies is also very integral to the aims of the Common Core State Standards. As you can see here, it says, students who are college and career ready appreciate that the 21st century classroom and workplace are settings in which people from often widely divergent cultures and who represent diverse experiences and perspectives must learn and work together. And so basically, to understand and seek these perspectives, it's really important to bring in people from varied backgrounds and have a deep understanding of different regions of the world, which is something that Primary Source strives to do along with the IB and other bodies. So before we begin, I would like to now introduce to you Barbara Petzen, and Barbara will come on and give a very brief introduction and then get into her slides and sort of tell you more about our topic for today. Barbara?
Good morning, everybody. There we go. It's really great to see so many of you got up this morning and joined us. If you're in the Americas, so this is sort of your morning. If you're elsewhere, welcome for whatever time of day it is. I'm really glad to have everybody here. I'm hoping that, there we go. I have far more, as those of you who may know me already know, I've prepared far more than we could possibly do in the next half an hour. But I wanted to present a new resource that we've created with Primary Source on voices of modern Middle Eastern women, but also to talk about how do we think about women in the Middle East. And this has been a passion of mine since my graduate student days. Before I got into actually doing outreach, I was doing a PhD in history concentrating on gender at Harvard University when 9/11 happened. And that really transitioned me from doing a typical academic track of working in higher education, in gender studies and history, into really understanding that I felt a calling to work with the public more generally, and particularly with teachers who often don't have the opportunity to study about particular regions of the world before they in fact have to teach different regions of the world in their classes. And that's particularly true of the Middle East, or perhaps I should say that I think it's particularly difficult to teach the Middle East because it is such a controversial region, because the United States is politically involved and has been politically involved in the region for many, many years, and that's not likely to change. And because there are a lot of issues that can be quite contentious. Gender is one of those, the role of Islam is another, and those are both things that we're going to be talking about. So over the years since 9/11, I've been working with teachers around the country, both in terms of developing curriculum and in terms of doing workshops like the webinar that we're doing today. So I'm happy to answer any other questions about my background that might be useful. But I want to say at the outset, because often people wonder for some reason, because I talk about Muslim women or Middle Eastern women, I just want to say up front that I am neither from the Middle East nor am I Muslim. My interest in the region and in gender studies comes from an academic place, not necessarily a place of personal experience, although of course I've spent a significant amount of time in the region in a variety of countries. So that's me. And I want to start by introducing you to a quote that I think many of you will already know. This is The Danger of a Single Story, which is one of the most popular TED Talks ever by Chimamanda Adichie. And this quote, I think, is really important because it gets to the heart of some of how we think about the Middle East and other cultures in general, but particularly I think about Middle Eastern women. And she's talking, of course, about how when we have one story that represents another culture, that creates stereotypes. And it can be very difficult for us to break out of that overarching story. Now, in this case, I'm not talking about a single story that one person has told, but a kind of cultural narrative. And that cultural narrative looks like this when we talk about the Middle East. That is that we have a very strong narrative that is about how women in the Middle East look, how they feel, and what the constraints on their lives are. And I think these are the kind of the elements of that story. Women in the region are oppressed. Period. When I ask people, what's one thing we know about women in the region, the word oppressed is the single most common response that I get. Women are forced to cover themselves, and veiling, what the veil means in many people's ideas, is usually either this very encompassing niqab, or it's something like the Afghan burqa, that incorporates a face veil. The third thing is the many restrictions that people believe that Middle Eastern women or Muslim women in general cannot do, right? They cannot go to school, they cannot drive, they cannot vote, they cannot work, they cannot travel, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a sense that women's lives are all about those constraints. And we actually know very little about women's lives beyond the things that they cannot do. That is, that we don't necessarily think about what they can do, or what they do. We only think about what they may not do. And therefore, we see them as sort of without action, without purpose, silent and subservient. And that's often because we're not listening to actual women's voices. And then the final thing is that the problem is usually seen to be religion, typically Islam, right? It's about culture, and it's about the domestic nexus. So that women's problems are not public problems, in a sense. They're not problems of policy, of politics, of economics. They're seen as problems that are cultural problems that are essential parts of the Middle East. That is, that these are often not seen as solvable problems unless people change their culture and become, with this hidden subtext, of course, more like us. So that's the stereotype that I'm kind of coming in to address. So this is how I think we might want to look at the issues that women in the Middle East have by looking at women's voices. And when you look either at polling data or you look at the actual products of women across a wide variety of fields, what you find is that women are talking about the particular problems in their society, in their city, in their country, local problems that they think have particular solutions. So it's much more specific when you're talking to women in the region. They're interested in the particular problems that they see around them. They're not looking at these all-encompassing cultural questions. Secondly, women think that whether to veil or not veil should be an individual choice without political pressure. That is that I think veiling has become very politicized both in terms of how the West sees the Middle East or Muslims, but it's also politicized inside countries in the region, and women are very resistant to having that choice made for them by politicians or others, or by people misreading what the veil means for them, right, as seeing it as some kind of an identity card that matches them to some political or cultural movement. The third thing is that across the board, if you look at the data, whether women veil or not, whether they see themselves as religious or not, whatever their political views are, they think that women should have an equal opportunity to participate in society on many, many levels, to get an education, to work, to vote, and they're focused on the barriers to those things. That is that, again, they're not engaging in a large cultural discussion. They're very specifically focused on what they want and how to get there. They think that they need to solve their own problems. What no people want in the Middle East is people from outside telling them this is where you're wrong, this is what's wrong with your society, and this is how you should fix your society, i.e. by becoming more like us. Women in the region know very well what their problems are, and depending on where they are in the political spectrum, they have different ideas about how to solve those problems. And they see themselves as the agents of that change. And they really see that their problems are political and economic as much as they are cultural and social. And so they're trying to solve those problems in those arenas as well. And the final thing is that if you look at the data, it's really clear that for women, most of the problems that they're worried about are the same problems that men face. That is that they don't see that as women, they have an entirely different set of issues on which they should be focused. But they see themselves as part of their societies and engaged in their societies' issues as a whole. So when we're thinking about women in the contemporary Middle East then, what I'd like to put forward as questions we should think about is how do we know what we know about women in the Middle East? Are we hearing their voices, or are we simply having it interpreted for us by some talking head experts like me, look, I'm a talking head, who are telling us what to think about women in the Middle East? How do we measure the status and roles of women? Is it by listening to them? Is it by some objective set of criteria? And who designed those criteria? And who's doing the measuring how? So that's another way of thinking about it, so that often the way that we get measures of women's status are by Western yardsticks, not necessarily by yardsticks that might be more universally applicable. And then think about how would you apply those questions to our own society. That is, are we only asking questions which we expect to get a negative response from in the Middle East, for example, or are we asking questions where Western societies might also be seen by outsiders to have problems? So that, for example, if you ask a question about honor killing, that's a question that's designed to focus on a problem that's seen as a particular Middle Eastern problem. But if you refocus that question as an issue of domestic violence, you might find that there are parallel problems in a wide variety of societies, for example. How do we hear women's voices from the region? How do we get past that kind of blind or the blinkers of our own societal perceptions and actually hear these women? And this is where I'd really like to introduce this new resource, which I'm quite proud of, this Women's Voices in the Modern Middle East, which is a multimedia online resource that's available for anyone to use with their students. And it presents a whole variety of primary sources, and that's what we were really trying to do, is not simply give texts, although there are many texts associated with it, but also other kinds of multimedia, so that it's more engaging for students, and it presents women in their voices in a way that you can actually hear their voices. And I think that's really important. I think often when we talk about voice, we talk about it in a particularly literary way, and I think it's really cool to think about voice in an audio way, like actual voices as well, because it's so much more human, and we so rarely get the chance to hear Middle Eastern women in their own bodies, in their own voices. I think that's very powerful. So this is the homepage of the resource. You can see that the web address there is resources.primarysource.org/women's voices. And this is just the original rationale. But what I wanted to show you, and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor moving. Samira, can you tell me if that, I forgot to check and see if that shows up, but there's a background essay, and then you can see that there are 3 different tabs here focusing on 3 different women, and then a variety of other resources, one of which I'll show you in particular. In fact, here, this is the background essay, which, as you can see, I wrote, on the diverse roles and aspirations of Middle Eastern women. And it talks about, starting from the contemporary with the Arab Spring and women's struggles after those revolutions to defend their rights in the new constitutional processes in terms of sexual harassment, for example, in Egypt, which has been an enormous issue. And then also going back and looking historically at the rights of women in the region and what have been historical effects upon them. And I also just want to preview, if you look on the left-hand side under multimedia, we've also done an extra Google Earth tour that highlights the biographies of a number of other women. And one of the reasons that we did that is because we would really like students to begin to create their own biographies of interesting women from the region they find. And Google Earth is a really great way to do that. All right, so let's look a little bit further. I just want to introduce you to these 3 women. Now, unfortunately, because we don't want to crash everyone's viewing pleasure by extending the bandwidth beyond what it can bear, I'm not going to show you the actual video or audio of these women, but I'm hoping that you will go on after this and look at some of these resources because they're really quite special. This is a terrific TED Talk by Elif Shafak, who is a novelist from Turkey. She's written a number of books, and the particular book that we are featuring in this collection is a book called The Bastard of Istanbul. Fascinating book that tracks 2 different families who turn out to be linked, one living in Istanbul and the other in the United States. And it revolves around the question of Armenian identity and the Armenian genocide and how people in the United States, especially in the Armenian community, view it, and how people in Turkey also see it, and how different their perceptions are and how those perceptions are created historically and in terms of their contemporary lives. It's a fascinating read. But she also, in addition to that book, she did a TED Talk that's really talking about the politics of writing fiction. And I found this really interesting, especially if you are thinking about the Common Core and how to think about literary texts and nonfiction texts and how they relate to understanding culture. And this is really the kind of guiding idea behind this particular set of resources. So this is what the resource will look like on a page, right? This is the Elif Shafak page. And there's a little bit of background about her. There are terms that might help students understand the resource. And then there are a number of other elements. So one is key questions, and here, you're really looking at the questions of identity in literature and politics in literature, and understanding the relationships between those things. And I think one final really interesting question about who decides the meaning in fiction. Is it about the author? Is the author telling you what the meaning is, or is it up to the reader to decide? Or is it some more complex algorithm between those two? Then we have for each one of these figures a pre-learning activity and a primary source activity, and often an extension as well. And in the pre-learning activity, what we have generally done is do something to set up the context, the social context, the cultural context in which that work is set. So in this case, we're looking at not only an overview of the Armenian genocide, but of the kind of political trouble that Elif Shafak got into in Turkey because she wrote a book about it, and how the regime in Turkey responded to her, seeing it as a threat. Then we have the primary source activity for this particular author, and it's looking at the TED Talk that she did on politics of fiction and understanding the idea of a cultural ghetto and how literature can help you break out of it. And then there's, again, an extension activity talking about where I pulled out two different quotes from that TED Talk, which seem to contradict each other, right? So on the one hand, when we read a novel, we leave our small, cozy apartments behind, go out into the night alone, and start getting to know people we have never met before and perhaps had even been biased about. So literature as a window into, or a doorway into, another culture. And then at the same time, she says, as much as I love stories, recently I've begun to think that they lose their magic if and when a story is seen as more than a story. So the danger of seeing literature as a real reflection of the quote-unquote truth of another society. That is, that we need to understand that stories are also a point of view about another culture, and that in order to really understand another culture, you need multiple perspectives on that culture, and you need to see literature as a way of highlighting human issues and human problems in a way that makes them, of course, very dramatic, and that doesn't necessarily represent people's daily lives in that particular society. And I thought that was a very interesting idea for students to explore. All right, then there's another one of the women that I thought we would introduce you to, and her name is, her stage name is Salome. I should take that back immediately. She doesn't have a stage name in Iran, at least, because, of course, she's never appeared on a stage. And that is because she is both female and a hip-hop artist. And you are not allowed to perform hip-hop publicly in Iran. And you are not allowed to perform publicly if you're a female vocalist. So on both counts, Salome is out of luck as a public performer in Iran. However, it turns out that in Iran, most music is performed not publicly, but online and or in private performances. And so Salome has been a very active member of the music scene, the new music scene in Iran, which is very vibrant. She's declared that she's not a political artist, and yet when world events or events inside Iran demand it, she has felt compelled to create songs that really reflect that. And the song that we're focusing on is one of those songs. So here is, again, the background. So a little bit of background about the music scene in Iran today, where it comes from. And you can see, I hope everybody will go and check out these different links. The guitarist Ali Azhari, the rappers Hitchcock, who I love, and the rock band Ohum, which are all wonderful artists, and there's a lot of meat there for your students to explore beyond Salome herself. And then there's information on this particular song, Drunk Shah, Drunk Elder. Oh, I should point out here, I just wanted to show you guys that there are all of these terms, so that if there are things that are confusing in the lyrics or that she talks about, we've created a glossary item so that students can come back and check their understanding. So this is about, how does a young woman in a conservative society who clearly doesn't fit what that society or what the elders in that society think is an appropriate role for women, how does she express herself? How does she get that viewpoint out? And what are the consequences for her? And then maybe what are the parallels between Salome's issues in Iran and her struggles to make her voice heard with those of people in the United States, either now or in history. So the pre-learning activity here is about the youth context in Iran. I think in order to understand Salome and what the issues that she's talking about, it's very important to understand her generation. So we walk through some demographics about what's going on in Iran and what's happening with young people. And then actually the primary source is the video that Salome created for her song, Drunk Shah, Drunk Elder. Now, I think it's fascinating, of course, that the song is about drunkenness, which of course is forbidden in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it's clearly comparing very explicitly the old regime of the Shah and the new regime of the Ayatollahs, and saying that they are equally as corrupt as one another. That is, that the revolution might as well never have happened in terms of issues like freedom and development for the people. And what I'd like you to notice from this screenshot from the video, she has actually done all of her own subtitles for this. But there's also a textual element to this video, so that what she's done is she's asked certain questions in the video that are happening at the same time as she's rapping something else. So she's got this rap going on the one hand, but then she has textual elements where people are holding up placards that ask and answer questions about what their aspirations are or what is the most important thing for development in our society. And a variety of people are answering those questions. So the primary source activity asks students to listen to the song and to look at the lyrics, and but at the same time to also pay attention to what is going on in terms of the text, the written messages that are also a part of the video. So understanding the kind of complex layering that Salome is doing with the video. And we've also given you, of course, the lyrics for the video itself so that they can look at those while they're watching the video so that they can go back and check their understanding of the lyrics. And again, I think the lyrics are very interesting. The refrain for this thing is, Iran's fate is in God's hands. Now here you have this young woman who is, looks very goth, is doing a hip-hop video, is very young and chic, and yet she's critiquing the Islamic Republic from an Islamic standpoint, right? Iran's fate is in God's hands. The problem with the Ayatollahs is that they're hypocritical and they're acting against religious values. And that's a very interesting critique coming from someone who we would assume that because she's against the Islamic Republic, she must therefore be entirely secular. But her critique is not coming from that place. So I thought it was a very interesting voice for us to hear. And what we decided to do is in the extension activity to contrast her voice with that of another woman who's also using poetry, but in this case it's a Saudi poet named Hissa Hilal. And I'm not sure if any of you have heard of her. She became very famous about a year and a half ago, I think, perhaps 2 years, when she won the equivalent of American Idol in Saudi Arabia, which is not a singing contest, but which is, in fact, a poetry contest, both extemporaneous poetry and poetry that is composed on the spot for this live audience, or, they have a very short amount of time to compose it. And this woman who, I have to say, I identify with her on some level because she's 5 feet tall and has 4 children. So I feel like she's my doppelganger in Saudi Arabia. And she wrote this poem and performed live in front of all male judges, a poem that excoriated the religious establishment for being hypocritical. So here you can see the first part of her poem, talking about, the evil muftis who are issuing these rulings, and who are condemning as unlawful that which is allowed. And she compares them to suicide bombers and terrorists, and talks about how they've cowed everyone in society from speaking the truth, which she, of course, this 5 foot tall woman, is willing to do, is courageous enough to do. Although she has to remain fully covered, she can still use her voice in very powerful ways. And I think that's a really powerful message for us to understand, is that just because we can't see the face doesn't mean that that person doesn't have a voice and a perspective and the power to change their society. Then the last person that we wanted to introduce you to is Tawakkol Karman, who is the activist from Yemen who won the Nobel Peace Prize. And she is, again, the multimedia primary source that we have is her Nobel Prize speech, her acceptance speech. So it's looking at what are the issues she wanted to highlight at this most important moment. And what's really interesting, I just wanted to show you this quote because this is when she was talking, I think, to the New York Times. And this is the kind of thing that she's talking about. She's talking about young people. She sees herself as part of a youth movement. She doesn't see herself as part of a women's movement. Of course, gender issues are one of the things she's talking about, but it's at the end of a long list. And political freedoms, freedom of expression and development are the first things that she typically talks about. So here again, you have the background essay to give you some context. You have terms. You have a pre-learning activity about the challenges that Yemen faces and asking students to figure out if they were in her shoes, what would be the primary issues that they would want to address in Yemen. And then looking at the speech, both in text form and with the video, side by side, going through really carefully and really pulling this text apart to think about who are the role models she's looking at, what are the main issues that she's trying to address, and how is she trying to address them. She's a real proponent of nonviolence in a society that is increasingly violent. This is a society where almost every grown man carries a knife, and many of them carry guns, where there are kind of traditional codes of manliness that espouse violence, and there's also been a very recent civil war, and there's a rising Islamist movement, in addition to the fact that the U.S. has been using drones to attack militants in Yemeni territory. And that's not even bringing in, border skirmishes with the Saudis. So there's a lot of violence in Yemeni society, and yet here comes this woman as the voice of youth saying, you know what, our real issue, the way that we can address all of our problems is through nonviolence. A very, very radical voice inside Yemen, and yet one that has been extremely popular and powerful. So the extension activity there is to simply ask students to imagine that they have won the Nobel Prize 20 years from now, and what is it that they've done, and what are the principles that their life of activism has been based upon. So trying to get them to sink themselves into this global future as active changers of their environment. I want to open it up to questions as soon as I can, because I really would like this to be about questions you might have about the resource, but also questions more generally about women in the Middle East today. But I wanted to show you something that I'm really passionate about, and that is using Google Earth and other ways to connect the voices of women or voices of people in general to some kind of geographical understanding of the world and the Middle East in particular. And that's because I'm again and again surprised and dismayed to see how little students connect the voices or the resources that they see with kind of global realities. And I think geography is a very concrete way to get them to understand some of those questions, and also to understand in a very small geographical region how different lifestyles can exist at the same time. And I think that's really important for them to get a sense of scale. So when inside the voices of women in the modern Middle East, you have these this Google Earth tour. So when you click on it, it will open up in Google Earth on your own computer. If you haven't downloaded Google Earth yet, A, download it now, but B, it will prompt you to download the application. And then open it up and you will have the biographies of a number of different women. And again, we've chosen these women to be kind of a geographic spread and an interesting set of women to look at, but the idea is really to prompt kids to think about, what other women are there that we don't know about, who are in the region doing interesting things, making change in their own societies. So the 5 women that we have here are Shirin Ebadi, again a Nobel laureate from Iran, who's a human rights lawyer. And I think before she won the Nobel Prize, if you had asked people in the West whether women in the Middle East could be such a thing as a human rights lawyer, you would have a lot of people doubting whether that was even a possibility. And yet here is a woman who has fought for many years and continues to fight for the rights of women within the Islamic Republic of Iran, within that legal code and that political context, and has made great headway in, if not protecting every woman that she's able to represent, at least highlighting their cases and helping to effect some change, and to make sure that people know what the challenges for women in Iran are, and to try and hold the regime at least to the ethical standards that it espouses within an Islamic context for women. The next is Queen Rania of Jordan. I don't know if any of you have seen her YouTube channel, but it's one of the most popular YouTube channels in the world, much less in the Middle East. She did one great piece when she spoofed David Letterman's top 10 list, which is what we've given you a link to here. The top 10 reasons she has a YouTube channel of her own. She's very, very funny. But she also uses that sense of humor and her appreciation of contemporary tech tools, social media tools like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube to really affect change in the region. And I think that's, she's a really powerful figure because of that. The next is Riverbend, which is the name of a pseudonym of a blogger during the Iraq War. This is now a historical document, but a fascinating one. Here you had a student, a female student, who was in Iraq during the war and blogging as a girl about what she saw going on around her. So it's both about gender topics, but also just in general about what is the experience of war from the perspective of a young girl. And then there's Fatima Mernissi, who is a very important author from Morocco, has written a wide number of books, both novels and nonfiction, as a sociologist. And she really is writing from, again, within a progressive, I would say, Islamic voice, but also one that appreciates some kind of gendered elements of Islam, perhaps more Sufi elements in some ways, but also, you know, the ethical messages of the Quran. So it's voices like Fatima Mernissi's, which are often used to counterbalance what we would call Salafi voices in the region that are kind of, you know, the old word we used to use was fundamentalist, and then we said Islamist, and then jihadist, and, you know, we continue to come up with new ways of talking about these very extremist voices that are using, if I can say, radically conservative interpretations of Islam in order to espouse their own identities, but which also often have a very negative impact on women. So those are one last person who I thought was a very interesting voice to hear. Her name is Huda Nunu, and she's actually the ambassador of Bahrain to the United States, and she's a Jewish woman. So, you know, who would think that a very conservative Gulf Islamic regime, monarchy, would send as their ambassador this progressive Jewish woman. And yet she has been the ambassador through very difficult times for Bahrain and between Bahrain and the United States over the last few years. So I think that's, again, very, very interesting figure for people to look at. So even within these few women that we've been able to highlight for you, you can see, you know, what a wide variety of voices that there are. And of course, we're looking at women whose voices are quite prominent, so that they're people that you can find and find other materials on and go back to. Of course, there are many, many bloggers, and there are many singers, and there are novelists and poets and TV producers and, you know, talk show hosts and religious scholars, you know, business people, a huge variety of women's voices out there to be discovered. We've hopefully given you just a starting place to think about women's voices and how they're all struggling to make their own position and the position of women, of young people, of people in their society generally better. So these are not passive women. They are not subservient. Do they face oppression in their lives? Absolutely, but I believe that we all face oppression in our lives. And what's interesting is to see how they define the oppressive elements in their lives and how they attempt to change and fight them. So just as the final notes, I think it's really important when you're talking about women from the Middle East or women in Muslim cultures, you need to be really careful to be specific, to look at the local and historical context of those women rather than simply making blanket statements about religion or culture very broadly, because they will almost certainly not be true in many cases. You need to hear the voices of women themselves, which is, of course, why we put this together. and look at the range of women across these kinds of criteria of class and education, urban-rural splits, ethnicity, political party, local culture as opposed to, something called Arab culture or Middle Eastern culture or Muslim culture, to look very specifically at what the local issues might be, and not simply to look at gender or religious doctrine as determinants of women's lives. And then, again, just to really emphasize that when you talk to women, they will typically see gender issues as only one part of a complex of problems in their society that they are trying to address. And most of those problems face men as well as women. That is, illiteracy and poverty, and how those two things are intertwined, unemployment, and that unemployment for women is much higher than unemployment for men, but it is probably because unemployment for men is so high that women find it so difficult to make the argument that work is as important for women as for men, since men are considered to be the primary breadwinners, and that's their responsibility, often societally defined. If men can't find work, if you have 25% unemployment, how do you make the argument that women should also be allowed to have well-paying and fulfilling jobs? It's very difficult to do that. And we can find, obviously, correlations for that in American history as well. And, things like political oppression and political change that uses women as kind of a scapegoat on the progressive side or on the conservative side. All of those are issues that women talk about as being things that affect the society as a whole and not just them. Okay, well, why don't we leave that there, and I'd really like to hear your questions and see if we can have some answers there. Oh, I guess Samira's going to come to that later, so I'll just leave it on this really boring page, and we can get some questions going.
Barbara, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think it's always extremely fascinating to hear, like you said, the very authentic women's voices that traditionally and I think stereotypically are seen as very oppressed. So thank you for that detailed look into those poor women's lives. And as Barbara said, at this point we are very open to questions. Please feel free to type in questions in the chat box, and that's one way I can ask Barbara. Or if you would like to ask your own question, if you can raise your hand, and then I can call on you, and then we can go forward and ask your question. So we actually have a question from Kara here, and she says, do you have any opinions on the book 9 Parts of Desire by Geraldine Brooks? Do you feel it uses an appropriate point of view?
I mean, I would never say that a point of view is, appropriate or not appropriate, but I would definitely contextualize it. And I think that, there are so many books that have been written by Western women, feminists, journalists, sociologists about women in the Middle East. And, I say this as a Western woman who studies women in the Middle East. I don't think that it's okay for Western voices to be the ones that are always contextualizing the region. And particularly when I think it's often the case that people allow their own perspective and their own ideology to frame the kinds of women that they talk to and the kinds of voices that come through in their work. So I think what would be really interesting is to take 9 Parts of Desire, whether we agree with that perspective or not, right? So it's not necessarily that people don't identify with or sympathize with the point of view that she's putting across, but it's also to contrast it with other voices from the same society and to look at, other Iranian women who have different ways of thinking about the same kinds of issues. So I think that, one voice is never enough. And even more than that, one Western voice is never enough when you're looking at the region. And one of the problematic things that we have is that when we're looking at trying to find authentic voices from other parts of the world, there's a language barrier to start with, so it can be difficult to access authentic voices that are not educated in a Western paradigm so that they know how to speak English and that they're concerned to speak English to the world, or that they've been translated for that purpose. So it really requires some some delving into these societies to find those other voices, and to then, give students, here's one perspective and here's another perspective. How are they different? That to me is the real key. It's not whether one text or another text is appropriate or valid, but it's simply looking at how those texts illuminate one another or illuminate one another's perspectives. And that, I think, is a much more interesting assignment anyway. So I would never say don't use it, but I would think you should use it in conjunction with other things.
So you would say that it is appropriate for students? That was Carrie's second part of her question.
I think that pieces of it can be appropriate for students. I'm not sure, and it depends on your students. It depends on your context. I mean, I know Betsy has had the conversation. Betsy is at an independent school, and she can work with, with relatively high ability students. She can give certain texts that a teacher who's in a public school that might have more political restrictions in some sense, and who might or might not have students at the same reading level. So your context best, and that's always something that I think is very local in American education. So that's one piece of it. But I would probably excerpt it and use it with excerpts of more kind of authentic voices from within Iranian society.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so I'm happy to take more questions either via the chat box, or we can do it through if someone wants to raise their hand. And, Betsy has commented, she says that the play 9 Parts of Desire is a great resource for people, So it is, as you said, a really good idea to have different voices just to sort of provide the contrast and the depth within a given society. So,
and I would say that's true even if it is a text that's coming from within the society. So, for example, Persepolis, which is another text that I really like, and I would love to use it, but I would be uncomfortable using it as the only way kids understood Iran or Iranian women or questions of gender in Iran, because the author has a very specific socioeconomic background and political take on the events in Iran. So, for example, her take on what's going on in Iran, or what has gone on since the revolution, would be very different than, for example, Salome, who's grown up in Iran under the revolution her whole life. And it might be very different again from, a third woman who has a very different take on what's going on. So one voice is never enough, no matter whose voice it is.
Well, thank you for that, Barbara. So if there are any more questions, please feel free to type it in. And if not, you can also ask a question if you raise your hand. I have a note for you, Barbara, and this is something I think on a more contemporary note. There has been a lot of talk about the women's situation in Saudi Arabia around driving and, and I think a lot of students are very intrigued about it. How do you approach this topic in the classroom in terms of trying to bring in that authentic voice or voices regarding such a sort of heated debate and something that people in other societies find very difficult to understand?
Right. It's such an interesting issue, and I think that, it's a great way to open up a conversation about our perspectives of what's most important in a society versus people inside the society, which is not to say that there aren't women in Saudi Arabia, obviously, who consider driving to be their kind of cause célèbre. And those women are really interesting, and, I really am fascinated by their struggle, and that they've really taken this issue of driving to stand for a whole set of ideas about women's autonomy, right? And about, it's a substitute for them, or it's a way of talking about the right to work, for example, and the right to be able to travel without a male guardian's permission. A whole set of very restrictive rules in Saudi Arabia about, how much autonomy women have in the public sphere. And in that sense, it's a very important issue. When you talk to most Saudi women, it is not the issue that they bring to the fore as being the most important. right? They are much more likely to bring up issues specifically around employment or around quality of education. So, for example, it often, when people think about the fact that Saudi women aren't allowed to drive, it often makes them think about a society where women are not allowed to leave the home, for example, to get an education, etc. In fact, in Saudi Arabia, more women are in university than men, and they do better at university than men. So as in Iran, so the two most conservative societies in the Middle East, for all of their defects when it comes to gender, and they are legion, they both give a very high priority to women's education, to the extent that Iran recently backpedaled and wanted to preserve a certain quota for men in the engineering school because so many women were doing so well in the entrance exams, men were being forced out of the most prestigious programs. So in Saudi Arabia, women may not be able to drive themselves, but they still have been able to have excellent educational achievements. The problem is that once they achieve these educations, there's nowhere for them to work. There's no room in the economy for them to find private sector or public sector jobs. So most women in Saudi Arabia are really arguing for an opening up of the economy to provide jobs for women. Or an opening up of the political system so that, women also can't vote in Saudi Arabia for anything other than municipal elections. But women now have been given that right to vote just as men have. It's just that nobody in Saudi Arabia has a lot of democratic power of the vote, right? So women are arguing for that general societal change and opening, not necessarily for this very particular thing about driving. That being said, it's really interesting to watch them struggle for this right as part of a suite of, or a very visible way of agitating for women's rights in society. What's interesting to me is that, again, our perception of this debate over women and driving in Saudi Arabia is very different from the perception of women in Saudi Arabia. That is, that women will often be driven to the mall, for example. But then once they're in the mall, they move through that public space. And very often there are interactions with, other people, including men, at that public venue, or in restaurants, or in other venues. So now they're not supposed to be associating with single men that aren't in their family, but there are public areas where that happens, as well as happening in cars. And there are some really interesting works of fiction and semi-fiction, like Girls of Riyadh, for example, that kind of explore the dynamics of how one, especially in elite Saudi society, how some of these rules are broken all the time. And so, when you see a rule being promulgated over and over and over, as a historian, I know that's always a sign that people are not obeying it, right? So I think that sometimes when you look at these kinds of restrictions, you also need to look at how those restrictions are being sidestepped. And that gives you a different perspective on women's agency than necessarily just looking at the law. I don't know if that was a total answer to your question, but
no, it definitely is. I think, it's really important to sort of understand the broader context of something like discussing the driving ban. I think for me what's really interesting, and for those that, might not know primary source and my role in it, but I am from Bahrain, I am from the Middle East, and it's always interesting for me to see how Western media, or just media in general in the world, highlights specific parts of, certain larger struggles. So, if there is like a larger movement of trying to get greater rights, but it's the driving ban that sort of sees the most light and political light and social light, because I think that's something that a lot of people can connect to as well. So it's interesting to see what is played up and what is not highlighted.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So here we have another question here by Kristen, and she says, do you feel the media reinforces this Western stereotype of Middle Eastern women to promote our foreign policy?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So it's an interesting way to put it. I'm not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily say that the media is trying to promote our foreign policy. I think what the media is trying to do is promote itself, because that's what it does. It's that business. But I think that the media typically doesn't question our foreign policy particularly, and so we definitely have political actors who use it in that way, and we have very often media people who exploit the kind of sensational coverage of women's rights as a way of as a way that isn't necessarily trying to promote stereotypes, but I think it's coming out of the journalists and the editors' own sense of what the region is like, and that this is an example of how those people are. So that you very often see, for example, issues of, well, let's take the example of the sexual harassment of women in Egypt, right? So you will have often Western media covering it as, look at this very backward patriarchal society and what a terrible thing it is that women aren't safe on the street in Egypt. And they'll even talk to Egyptian women about what a terrible thing it is that men can't keep their hands to themselves, and that the rule of law is broken down and women are so vulnerable. And the way that the Western media often covers this is as an example of the oppression of women in Middle Eastern cultures, especially in Islam. So sexual harassment is not mandated by the Quran, okay? So what's really interesting to me is that the media miss the story that's right in front of them. That is, for example, that sexual harassment, while it's always been an issue in crowded urban environments in Egypt, has gotten much worse since the revolution. Why? What is it that's changed that's allowed this to happen? Is it politically motivated? Is it motivated by, gangs of young men who are affiliated with one political party or another? Is it opportunistic? Is it a function of the high rate of unemployment amongst young men in Cairo? Is it a function, in fact, of the fact that more women have been active in the public sphere, partly because of the Arab uprisings themselves? Is it because the issue of women's rights has become a much more hot political topic in Egypt from day to day because people are arguing over how women's roles and aspirations should be dealt with in the Constitution? So that's one piece, is that rather than looking at contemporary change, that this is a new development and what has changed recently to cause it, they focus on it as a kind of essential aspect of Middle Eastern culture. And the second piece that is really interesting is that they will have these Egyptian women talking about how they're trying to fight this and how they've developed, Facebook groups, and they've developed, all of these different kinds of online and in-person responses to this challenge. And rather than focusing on the fact that the women in society are challenging it from a whole variety of means, including high-tech social media and, a bunch of women who, I love this story. In southern Egypt, there were women in a beauty parlor, and a bunch of Salafist kind of gang members came in and started threatening them because they decided that women should not try to make themselves look attractive, and that was against their version of Islam. And so all of these deeply religious Muslim women in southern Egypt chased these guys out of the beauty salon with brooms, beating them over the head, and told them to go home and to quit bothering women. Now, tell me those women don't have agency, right? It wasn't a debate over, who's Muslim and not Muslim. It's a debate over who gets to decide for women themselves. And clearly Egyptian women have a whole set of ways of demonstrating their own agency.
That is great. Thank you for sharing that, Barbara. Yeah, I mean, I think the question of agency definitely comes up a lot, and that's an incredible piece of information. But with that, I'm afraid our time has run out. That's gone by very quickly. Just to share a few last thoughts, we have resources that you can definitely check out. We have resource guides. We have the Women's Voices in the Modern Middle East resource packet that Barbara has just been talking about, and that can be found online too. We have resource guides on gender in the Muslim world, and then another one on the modern Middle East. So we have several resource guides for you to check out on our website, which is resources.primarysource.org and / and then various different endings. But if you just go on our website, primarysource.org, you can find the resources tab there. And then, to stay connected, please become a fan of ours on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. You can visit our website where you can actually access all these resources. And we do send out newsletters, so please let us know. Email me if you want to be connected to that and if you aren't already on the list, and we'll make sure to add you to the list. Barbara, thank you so much for doing this webinar. It's been great having you, and you certainly, even though you are one voice, you have a wealth of knowledge that is definitely very useful for all of us to hear about and learn more about this area.
Well, thank you. It was a joy, as always.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, that's so great, Barbara. We really appreciate having you here. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.